I was born in 1963 in a quiet town tucked away in the rolling hills of Tennessee. My parents, Samuel and Linda Carter, were high school sweethearts who never left the town they grew up in. Dad worked at the local factory, a man of calloused hands and quiet strength, while Mom was a school teacher, the type who knew every kid's name and their troubles before they even spoke a word. Our house was nothing special, a modest, creaky two-story home with a porch swing that groaned under the weight of years. I was the middle child, stuck between my older brother, James, who could do no wrong, and my younger sister, Sarah, who was the apple of everyone's eye. If I'm being honest, I often felt invisible in that house, but maybe that's what made me so observant. Life in our town moved at its own rhythm. Summers smelled like fresh-cut grass and the smoky sweetness of barbecues, while winters were filled with the hush of snowfall and the crackling of our wood-burning stove. It was a simple life, but it was ours. I met Emily Parker when I was 16. She had auburn hair that caught the sunlight just right and eyes that always seemed to be hiding a secret. She was the preacher's daughter, which meant trouble for a boy like me. We spent that summer sneaking out to the river, sharing stolen kisses, and making promises we were too young to understand. I swore I'd marry her someday, but life had other plans. The day I left for college in Nashville, she stood on my front porch, arms crossed. "You're gonna forget me," she said, her voice wavering. "Never," I promised. But promises at 18 are like leaves in the wind. We wrote letters at first, then fewer. Eventually, I heard she married a banker and moved to Georgia. I never stopped wondering what could have been. College was a wake-up call. I thought I was smart, small-town valedictorian, big dreams, but the city had a way of humbling you. I struggled. Money was tight, and my grades slipped. I worked nights at a diner, slinging burgers and wiping down counters until my bones ached. That's where I met Mr. Thompson, a retired journalist who came in every night like clockwork. He'd sit at the counter, order coffee, black, and tell me stories of war zones, political scandals, and people whose voices would have never been heard without a pen and paper. "You got away with words, kid," he told me one night, sliding a worn-out notebook across the counter. "Write your truth." Those words changed my life. I became a journalist, starting at a small newspaper where I covered everything, from town hall meetings to high school football games. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. I spent years chasing stories, moving from town to town, city to city. I covered corruption in Chicago, protests in Washington, and once even found myself in the middle of a hurricane in Florida. The job was thrilling, but lonely. Then came Laura. She was a fellow journalist, sharp-witted and fiercely independent. We met covering a political rally, both elbowing for the best spot. She challenged me in ways no one else had, and before I knew it, I was in love. We married in 1992. Life was good, really good. But life has a cruel sense of timing. In 1998, our son Matthew was born premature. The doctors did everything they could, but he only lived for 3 days. I still remember the weight of him in my arms, how impossibly small he was, how Laura and I sat in that sterile hospital room, staring at the empty bassinet, not knowing what to say. Grief changes a person. It changed us. Laura buried herself in work, and I drowned in silence. The apartment, once filled with laughter, became a place we avoided. We stopped talking. We stopped touching. One night, I came home late and found a note on the kitchen table. Just 6 words. "I can't do this anymore." She was gone by morning. The next few years were a blur. I left journalism, packed a bag, and traveled, looking for something, anything to make sense of what had happened. I lived in Paris for a while, writing poetry that no one ever read. I worked on a fishing boat in Alaska, feeling the cold bite my skin as I stood on the deck, watching the waves swallow the horizon I found solace in people, strangers who shared their stories over cheap coffee in roadside diners. A widowed farmer in Nebraska, a war veteran in Arizona, a single mother in Texas working 3 jobs to make ends meet. Their stories became my own. It took me 10 years to realize that no amount of running would change the past. In 2010, I returned to Tennessee. My parents had grown old while I had been gone. My father, once strong and unshakable, had slowed, his hands trembling with age. My mother still looked at me with the same knowing eyes, as if she had always understood my need to leave. I bought a small cabin by the river, the same river where I had once whispered forever to Emily Parker. And I started writing again, not for newspapers, not for fame, just for myself. In 2015, I met Claire. She was a teacher, like my mother had been. She had 2 grown daughters and a patience I had never known. She didn't ask about my past. She simply sat with me on the porch, listening to the crickets and the whisper of the trees. For the first time in decades, I felt peace. We married quietly in the fall of 2018, surrounded by the people who had never given up on me. Now, I sit on this porch, watching the river flow like time itself, never stopping, never waiting. I've made mistakes. I've lost people I loved. But I've also found beauty in the unexpected. Life isn't about the big moments. It's about the quiet ones. The smell of rain on old wood, the sound of a child's laughter, the way love can find you even when you've stopped looking. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. No matter how far you go, home is always waiting.